I know. I had a boss that was in love with SUSE Linux, and if I ever have to use Yast again, I think I might slip my wrists.
Wow. Okay.
Dear Ruby developer, are you sick and tired of working on crappy old legacy code bases? There's got to be a better way. If you want to get a better job, here's what you can do. Find a technology that's really in demand, build a side project using that technology, and then use that side project as experience to get your next better job. I've done this myself several times. It definitely works. What I think is a really good technology to learn right now is Angular. Angular is really in demand right now, and it's not going away anytime soon. I have a free guide to getting started with Angular and Rails at angularonrails.com/rr. Good luck and enjoy this episode of Ruby Rogues.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Jerome Hardaway.
Hey, everybody.
Dave Kimura.
Hello.
Brian Hogan.
Hi, all.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick shout out for our free Ruby Summit. Go check it out at rubydevsummit.com. We also have a special guest this week, and that's Mark Locklear. Mark, do you want to say hi?
Hey, folks. Glad to be here and joining you from Asheville, North Carolina.
Now, I don't know if we've had you on the show before. Do you want to give us a brief introduction? Let us know who you are, what you do.
Sure. So, again, my name is Mark. So, I currently work for extension.org. We're a sort of USDA-funded, government-funded organization. We serve the cooperative extension service. A lot of people don't know what the cooperative extension service is, but there's usually a cooperative extension branch in every county and every state. If you're familiar, a lot of people are familiar with 4-H, and if you know about your 4-H youth group, that's where a lot of people know the cooperative extension service from. So we're sort of a national presence. Cooperative extension service is very fragmented. As I said, there's generally extension branches in each county in each state, and so we're sort of a national presence for the cooperative extension service. We've got a handful of websites that we maintain that are mostly Ruby and Rails based, although we've got some WordPress and Drupal sprinkled in. So I've been with extension.org for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was staff at a community college, mostly doing Rails stuff and just sort of general IT things. I'm also an adjunct instructor and am still an adjunct instructor with that same community college. And then sort of the 10 years prior to that, I was doing mostly quality assurance and testing work, and just sort of moved into development work in the last maybe 8 years.
Gotcha. And you authored a book, Learning Rails 5?
Yeah, so it was actually an update on an existing book. So the previous version of the book was Learning Rails 3. And as I mentioned, I'm an adjunct instructor. So I had used that book, Learning Rails 3, to teach a regular 4-credit class at the community college that I was at. And so this was this has been maybe 4 years ago or so, but the Rails was at Rails 4 at the time, and I was teaching Rails 3. And so after about 2 semesters of teaching the book, I knew it really well, and I said, I could really I feel like I could update this book to Rails 5. We were this was sort of in the fall of 2003, 2004, and so Rails 5 was sort of in edge at the time and was about to come out that next spring. And so I contacted the developers or the original authors and O'Reilly and just said, hey, I'd like to update the book. So a good part of the content stayed the same, but of course I just updated a lot of the syntax and things, and then rewrote a couple of the chapters. The authentication chapter, I rewrote that from scratch.
So, there's Rails tutorial. There are a bunch of books out there on Rails. What's unique about your book? Is your approach different, or is there different content?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think my approach is that much different. One of the things I think about when teaching is there's all kinds of learners out there. Folks learn in all kinds of different ways. Some are visual, some are more kinesthetic learners. So just from a general standpoint, I think there's nothing necessarily unique about this book. It's just a sort of a different way of approaching it. The first couple of chapters focuses on sort of hand coding rather than using scaffolding. We're using generators for controllers and models. Specifically, it sort of starts out that way. And then after, I think, chapter 4 or 5, we get into scaffolding. So I think it's just another option for students. It approaches Rails from a standpoint of no development skill at all. I mean, they're sort of, I guess, the only assumption would be that you know some HTML and just some basic things like, for loops and conditional statements. But other than that, there's not a big expectation of having a lot of technical knowledge up front.
Gotcha. So one of the things that I periodically hear people complain about is that Rails has gotten more complicated. Do you feel like it has? And do you feel like, and I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel on this too, because we all do Rails to some degree. It's gotten more complicated. So does that mean it's harder to learn, or, do you just approach it the same way and then talk about all the stuff they've added?
Yeah, I'll start. So that was one of the challenges with this book. The original version of the book, Learning Rails 3, of course, didn't have any API stuff in it, didn't have any action cable, anything like that. And that was one of the decisions up front that I decided to make, was to not add those things. Now I'm working with one of the co-authors now, and we're looking at adding chapters on those things. But to your original question is Rails harder to learn now? I don't think so, because it's been pretty backward compatible over the years. The sort of original framework, and I use that word loosely, but the sort of way to do things from a command line standpoint, those things are all still there. And the basic structure of a Rails app, it looks very much like it did 5 or 10 years ago. So in my opinion, I'd say no. I don't think it's more difficult to learn.
And I think they started standardizing a lot of things, like if you want to do this, here is your approach. I don't think, before it was very open and subjective to however you wanted to complete a task. And now with a lot more of their convention over configuration, I think, a lot of it's taken care of for you. But with that, they've also added a lot of new features. Now with in Rails 4, you had the introduction of active job, which is a extra piece that's just been added and baked into the Rails core. However, if that was not there, then you would have your own implementation and stuff. So I think even though it has gotten more complicated over the past few years, and then with Rails 5, you have action cable, and then Rails 5.1 was added with Webpack, and you have Rails secrets and some other stuff. But I think once someone gets accustomed to it, it's almost second nature, and there's a lot of less guesswork. The tutorials out there will all kind of mesh and match, kind of what you're trying to do, because now we have more of a standardization. So even though it could be a little more complicated than it was in the Rails 3 days, I think with the convention over configuration, as well as the support out there from the community, it's in a much better direction.
I agree with you, Dave. This is going to mark my 9th year of teaching Rails in some capacity. And it's gotten harder. It's gotten harder simply because web development has gotten more complex. If you look at the statements from DHH, Rails, he'll maintain up and down that Rails is not for beginners. Rails is a toolkit for professional web developers to get stuff done. And so that's why they're baking in all these things like jobs, and they're baking in the WebSocket stuff, and they're baking in the JavaScript stuff now, because you want to meet the needs of the modern web developer. I disagree that it's not for beginners. I think it's a great way for people to learn how to build web to database applications and all that. But I've seen one of the neat things that you get when you teach this in a setting where you can get feedback from people in real time, is that you can track that over time, and you can start seeing what are the places that people have pain points with. And there are certain things that thankfully have stayed exactly the same. There are other things that are just a little more confusing than they used to be. And so it's not so much that it's let me give you a great example. It's not so much that it's harder to learn. It's just a little harder to get started with. When they brought in the asset pipeline, all of a sudden you had additional dependencies you needed on some environments and some machines. You need to get Node installed as well as Ruby installed. Mm-hmm. And if you're already a developer doing those things, you don't notice that. But take a new student with a completely blank Windows machine and say, let's make a Rails application. 2 hours later, once you've finished installing everything, you can get started. And that's sort of the parts that are kind of weird. It's gotten a little more and more difficult on that end. But the fact is that what is Rails, right? If you go through one of these books and you stay completely on the pathway, like using your fixtures and using all the built-in components with Rails, the question I have always had as a teacher is, did I prepare myself or did I prepare my students to get their first Rails job when all of a sudden they run smack dab into a code base full of Factory Girl and RSpec and a bunch of other things that are not off the Rails core? Because that's the thing that makes Rails, I think, hard to learn is when a beginner comes in and says, "Oh, I'm doing this thing," and someone will say, "Oh, you should use RSpec," and then they'll say, "Oh, what's RSpec?" And they look on that. "Oh, you should use Cucumber. What's that?" And you look into that, and all of a sudden there's all these additional things. And I've seen some starter projects out there with 20, 30 different gems that are automatically configured to run, which is great for productivity. But one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years of Rails is that it's gotten a little different. There's lots of different ways you can do a Rails application.
It's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting you say that, Brian. I wonder if certainly can be more difficult for students, but it's more difficult for an instructor, approaching it from an instructor standpoint. Yeah. The options have gotten there's so many more options there, and the decision, just as you said, like, what is my goal for these students? Is my goal to get them a Rails job, which is, sort of a tall task, and at least in a college setting, in a typical 16-week class where we're meeting once or twice a week. Is that the goal? Is the goal just to, hey, I want to expose you to web development and software development, which is sort of how I approach things. I like to say, and I teach a Java programming class, which is sort of an intro Java class, that I'm not here to teach you Java as much as I am here to teach you software development. And oh, by the way, we're going to use Java to do that. So lots of times I approach Rails from that way, is that I'm here to teach you web development, and yeah, we're going to use Rails to do it. But my goal is to teach sort of concepts and ideas that are going to be broad enough that they're going to apply to whatever framework or whatever language you choose to work in.
Exactly. That's an awesome approach.
So what are kind of the core fundamental things then that people need to know in order to write Rails apps? Because it sounds like you need models and views and controllers and all of those kinds of things. But yeah, a lot of people really do get down into the weeds. Well, you really do need know how to write tests. You do need to know how to set up a job queue. You do need to know how to write CoffeeScript so that your JavaScript does the right thing in the right place at the right time. Are there things that you feel like every Rails developer really does need to know? Or is it just, okay, understand the basic structure and then move on?
Yeah, I sort of approach it from a standpoint, and I'm just looking through the table of contents of the book now. Again, we have I sort of structured around a 16-week course. We spend, and just as an example, we spent a week on testing, and I just use the typical, I use RSpec and those things, but we don't dive real deep into that. I try and focus on more the model view controller paradigm, so they understand that. And then just the basics of CRUD. I really focus on that CRUD piece too, that they sort of understand those things. And again, in my mind, those things are things that are transferable across whatever framework they choose to work in. I want to hit testing. I want to hit sessions and cookies. I want to hit user authentication. Those are all things we're going to touch. So in my mind, they need to have some understanding of what those concepts are in a general way. But, again, and whether it's, I think whether it's a 10-week boot camp or whether it's a 16-week college course, you have to make some decisions up front about how deep we're going to dive and how deep we're going to dig into certain concepts. And to me, a lot of the more basic stuff, again, the things centered around CRUD and, controllers, model view controller things are what I focus on more. And then I just sort of try and touch on these other concepts that, again, they're going to run into regardless of what framework they get into, but we're probably not going to dig really deep into those things.
Right. You have to, and I assume you kind of have to pick and choose how deep you're going to go in any one area, because if you throw too many things at your students, they're just going to be overwhelmed, and then they're going to kind of they're going to do it by rote as opposed to critical thinking, right? Yeah,
right. You really can, right? And that's the danger, and that this idea of overwhelming students, and again, I think the boot camp model as opposed to a 16-week course, I think you think about in a college setting, these kids have other classes they're in. They may be taking, they may be taking a math class, and it could be some higher level math. They could be taking other programming classes at the same time. So in that setting, again, my focus is more that I want to introduce them to the framework and introduce them to the concepts in a general way, because some of these students may not even be computer science or, at a community college. We call our program web technologies. They may not even be web technologies students. So in that setting, it's probably more of a broad stroke as opposed to in a boot camp setting. Again, at least the sales pitch for many boot camps is that, hey, we're going to get you a job in 8, 10, or 16 weeks. So I think it can be a very different approach. And let me say about the students, the commitment that they make. The commitment in a boot camp generally you think is going to be much, much more than what it is in maybe a college setting for many students. Certainly, some college students will dive deep into it. They may spend 10, 20, 30 hours a week in Rails or in whatever software you're learning, but it very well may be, only 5 to 10 hours per week. Whereas in a boot camp, they're doing their 8 hours, at maybe on site, and they may be doing another 2 or 3 hours at night once they go home. So I think those are two very different ways to approach it.
Yeah, to back that up, the data that I had from the online classes and the hybrid blended learning classes that I taught, I would say 80% of the students didn't begin the week's homework until 5 or 6 hours before the due date anyway. So even though they had the time on the calendar, they didn't necessarily have the entire week to work on the content for my courses.
And I think Jerome can speak to this too. Vetsu Code is very much more on the boot camp side, and a lot of these folks are maybe recently separated from the military, so this is what they're focusing on, like 24/7. They're learning, they're into software development and coding with a goal of, in two or 3 months that they want to be interviewing for a job. So
that is a normal practice. So you have to do a deeper dive, it's not just concepts that you have to focus on. You also have to focus on what the employers or HR managers are looking for as well. And something that Scott Hanselman, he shared with our cohort last week. We focus on having them do so much work and so much algorithmic projects and things of that nature that, it minimizes their chances of having a whiteboard. It was very funny. He's like, your goal should be to, do as much work you can on the front end forward to avoid whiteboarding as much as possible. And that's that's baked into the curriculum, but it's also, you have to know these type of things. Like you have to know a lot about testing, and you have to know a lot about this subject or about how architecture and data structures, things of that nature, as opposed to just, broad concepts and how algorithms work in regards to linked listing, things of that nature. So it's, I think it depends on the approach, or what is the purpose of the education is, I think, what everybody is agreeing on, right?
Yeah.
One thing I think is interesting in this conversation is that we came in to talk about learning Rails, and then we've been talking about teaching Rails. Is there an approach that students should be taking, or, people out there who are maybe doing self-teaching, or even if they're working at a boot camp, things that they can do to enhance their experience as they learn Rails?
No, I'd love to hear from everybody else. I have my own opinions on this, but I'm going to hold off.
KISS, I believe in the KISS, keep it simple, silly methodology. When it comes to Rails, just learn Rails, and then what I've seen at various boot camps, and one of our problems when we first started our curriculum building was everybody wants to jump on the hottest technologies, most popular things. So, for instance, you're talking about CoffeeScript and TypeScript and all these other things and the front end technologies when it comes to Rails. But the problem is when you jump too far ahead of more advanced things, like even going as far as like AWS and all this other stuff, you're not really focusing on Rails. So I think one of my biggest things I've seen is just keep it simple. Just focus on Rails. Just focus on CRUD apps. Focus on knowing the entirety of the framework, and not only focus on Rails, focus more on Ruby. You'd be amazed how many people are Rails developers, but they like never done the things like use Sinatra or, build a Ruby gem. And, these are things that can actually make you a better Rails developer by focusing on the core language as opposed to the framework. So I think that is one thing that a lot of education resources need to get away from before, there should be most people when they learn Rails, they learn Ruby in conjunction with Rails. I think it should be more about just learning Ruby standalone and then focusing on Rails. I guess a great case study is, I think we had honeybadger.io on the show. And one of the things that actually helped one of their clients, CodePen, was that they were using they were very heavy Ruby app when they were trying to upgrade from, I think it was like Rails 3 to Rails 5. And that actually made the upgrading of the Rails app really easy because CodePen.io was built so closely with Ruby versus just being really dependent on Rails and what Rails does for the developer. So that's one thing I think that people should, especially across the board, should focus much more deeper dive on the power of Ruby and what it can do versus just what Rails can do for the developer, and it would make better Rails developers.
Oh, you're so dead on with that. I'm just sitting here shaking my head over and over again, going, yes, this is exactly it. I find it so important. The working with Rails, when you're teaching it and when you're learning it, the student feels so motivated because they're building some things. And they're making this forward progress. And it's a little more fun than it is to just do some simple Ruby stuff. But there are opportunities from if you're the person presenting the material, there are opportunities to kind of drop down into the Ruby and kind of explain how it works. And conversely, when you're at a certain level as a learner, start cracking open the Ruby source code and looking at things and understanding how things work under the hood. Look under the Rails source code and see exactly how. Look at the helpers. Look how the string is being built. Look how the humanized stuff works. Look how the number to currency stuff works. Look at those things and see if you can reproduce them and write your own implementations of those as you learn. For that, because that's going to be the wall. That's where I see a lot of people hit the wall. Is they can certainly scaffold some stuff up. It's clear that they followed a book or a course, but when I ask them to do something that's a bit of a derivative, they hit a wall, and it becomes apparent that there's not enough Ruby knowledge there. There's the knowledge of the framework, but not enough Ruby knowledge. So that's yes, learn the Rubies and the Rails.
And to build on that, Brian, I feel the same way. And this is coming from someone who learned Rails and then went back and learned Ruby. All the magic, the quote magic that happens with Rails, I think it's really important to understand and almost demystify. This isn't magic. This is just, helpers that are helping you get to a end result quicker. But if you don't understand the core concepts, whether it is the scaffolding or the database migrations, or even the object relational mapper active record, what's really going on kind of behind the hood, then anything that deviates from your standard practice or what a book might show you how to do in just a general sense, you're not going to be able to accommodate. So with something like Devise, not understanding what Devise is doing in the background with the authentication, if you need to deviate from what Devise has as a standard and override some of the controller actions, then you're going to be at a complete loss, and you might even start trying to roll your own authentication, or you might try to look at a different gem when that's not really the solution. It's to understand the core concept around authentication and then to see Devise's implementation and then see what you need to do to override it while it's still maintaining the security that Devise provides.
I want to hear from Mark a very specific answer. Mark, when you've taught, what are the strategies that the most successful students that you've had? What are their strategies for learning the content, for learning Rails?
Sure. So one of the things I do is with my class, and I'll be curious to hear if you do this with yours, is they have a final project that they do. And we go back over, each and as requirements, like I have very, strict requirements for that final project, basically going back and incorporating everything you've learned. So, this app has to have user authentication. This app has to have, sessions and cookies, and you're actually using cookies to do stuff. But those students who I can tell really throw themselves in, I give them a general framework. Asheville, just a little plug for Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville is Beer City, USA, so they build a brewery app for their final app, and they add a list of beers, and then they can rate the beers based on the alcohol value, the amount of hops it's got, all these various things. But I also give them the option to, hey, you can come up with your own map as long as it hits all these requirements. Usually those students who choose to do their own map, which may be 20% of the students, something like that, the students who choose to do their own map are usually the ones that are most successful. Partially that's because I guess by the end of the class they're more comfortable with the framework, so they feel more comfortable sort of stepping outside of the requirements that I've gave them. But those students, you can tell, are motivated in that they have a specific problem maybe they want to solve, or they came to the class to begin with thinking, I'd like to write an app that would do this thing. So certainly those students who incorporate something like that, where they're actually building a real app that's going to do real stuff, something that maybe they're passionate about, are the most successful.
Right on. That's in line with some of the things that I've seen too. I tend to suggest that when it comes to anything, I tend to suggest that the way to really improve your skills, to really grasp these concepts, is to give yourself lots of time to practice. Mm-hmm. Spend a lot of time building if you've built an app, build it again. Even if it's the same thing, build again. And then build another thing. Build something that's similar to that. Okay, you've made a to-do list. Now make an application that lets you capture notes, like make a very simple Evernote clone, like without tagging or something like that. Right? Try different things. Re-implement or URL shortener, those kinds of things. Just keep practicing re-implementing existing projects out there in Rails, simply because you don't have to think about the problem domain. Right? You don't have to understand the problem domain. If you already understand it, you can just focus on practicing the language and the coding. One of the things that I have always seen separate the people who are the high performers in a education setting from the rest is that they're doing a lot more practice. Now, sometimes that practice, sometimes they have the ability, they can put that time to practice in. They are privileged enough to be able to put that practice time in. But it still becomes a vital part. And towards the end of my time teaching, I tried very hard to incorporate as much practice time in our face-to-face time as I could, because I thought that was actually more important than lecture and presentation. It was just giving them that time.
Yeah, generally all of the sort of class time that I have is an hour, or an hour or less of lecture, but then we always have an exercise part, which is just basically that. I sort of give them, okay, we're going to build a task app. It's going to have a date. It's going to have a description. It's going to have a title, and we want to sort it by, we want to capitalize the first letter of the word of each word in the title. I give them a handful of things and say, okay, go do it. And then I sort of hover around the room and help folks out. And I give them, I may give them 30 or 45 minutes to do that. And then I do a lot of pairing too. I'll also incorporate maybe those last 15 or 20 minutes. If somebody's got it nailed and they're done, all right, find somebody who's not done and go pair up with that person and work with them to sort of walk through the various steps.
Well, and that's helpful too, because you're not just making them do the exercise, but you're there to kind of help them get along and get as much out of it as possible with that time.
Sure. Yeah. And if I could, let me read. I've got this is the last paragraph in the foreword of the book, and I think maybe this speaks to a little something that Jerome was saying. So this is in the foreword, the final paragraph in the foreword of Learning Rails 5. It says, finally, I want to encourage you to learn Rails and assure you that you will benefit from this book, even if you do not go on to become a Rails developer. I can say this with confidence because Rails has become the gold standard for MVC architecture in web development. In addition to the general MVC structure, Rails also has created a workflow around migrations, DevOps tasks, REST, Git, and community support. For all of these reasons, even if you do not go on to do great things in Rails, you You will encounter some, if not all, of these challenges in whatever web development platform you choose to work in. By exposing yourself to Rails and its solutions to these challenges, you will learn best practices that can be applied to other frameworks and workflows.
This episode is sponsored by Compose.io. Compose is a fully managed database hosting with extra security, scaling, and performance. Hosted on dedicated SSD servers, you can pick from 9 highly available databases: MongoDB, Elasticsearch, Redis. Compose Enterprise comes with easy scaling, which means you can add additional nodes at any time. It's auto-scaled resources like storage, memory, and IOPS, RESTful APIs, central console to manage all your deployments, and premium support with guaranteed response time and priority ticketing. With Compose Enterprise, you can free up your time to focus on building your app instead of managing your database. Check them out at enterprise.compose.com. And if you try Compose, you'll get a free special edition t-shirt. Hurry, quantities are limited. That's enterprise.compose.com.
Cue applause now.
Right on.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
about right.
another thing that I encourage the listeners to do, if you are kind of that lone developer and you are just working on some personal projects, find a project that maybe you are passionate about or maybe not even care much about, and get with someone else and get some experience with some peer programming. Deal with and tough through some merge conflicts and really try to see what it's like working with other developers on the same application, because the way you structure your application to sustain multiple developers will change from just being a solo developer. And it's definitely something that is good experience to have. And I think you'll find that your code is ending up much cleaner because you are having to take into account multiple users working around the same code set.
That's an interesting question about Git. I'm curious what other folks are doing, Brian, if you include that. I introduced Git relatively early on, maybe the third or fourth week. And then, at one point I was going to have them, hey, we're going to submit all our assignments via Git, but there were so many issues just even with simple sort of push-pull requests and things like that I do expose them to it, but I don't include it in the class maybe as much as I should.
We included Git at the end of our first semester program courses, and because we tried many different ways, and we ended up with a lot of confusion and a lot of just people just doing what they were told, following recipes rather than thinking. Because they thought, well, this is part of Rails, right? Or this is part of JavaScript program. I just have to use this Git thing, and they didn't really understand what it was for. And and that happens when you're new and there's a lot of new material being thrown at you. And so we discovered the sweet spot is really to give them a bunch of time to feel how painful work is without it. And because then they can rely on their prior knowledge, they can rely on those learning pathways that already exist, and they can say, oh yeah, if I use this tool, I'm going to save myself a lot of pain from having to worry about previous revisions or tracking my changes or even keeping track of what I did at the end of the day. So we introduced it. We introduced it at that point, and then we had a class that was their last semester course, which required it was sort of a team project class, and they had to use it consistently throughout that course to track their changes, to do pull requests and things like that.
Yeah, I use a similar strategy in Learning Rails 5. I'm just looking through. Scaffolding is introduced in Chapter 5, but essentially you're sort of manually building a lot of the bits and pieces, and then scaffolding sort of wraps all that up for you. So similar to your strategy you're saying of, sort of experiencing the pain of doing things manually and then sort of introducing an easier way.
Well, my teaching mentor a long time ago suggested that she was sure this wasn't why they still do it, but she suggested it's a good learning approach. It's sort of like making you go through all that hassle of doing long division on paper and then finally giving you a calculator to do it for you.
Sure.
You appreciate the calculator a lot more.
Yeah. In the boot camp or the accelerated learning community, Git is the first thing, Git Markdown's first thing that you learn, or is the second, or you're either supposed to know it before you get to class, or you're going to learn it within the first 2 weeks of sessions. So that's what a lot of the boot camps are around. To piggyback on some of the information, some of the things you guys said about learning, I think one thing that the lone developer needs to know is to find a mentor, find someone that's willing to spend an hour or two a week with you, just to, help pair programs, see what type of problems you're having. In our cohort, Mark, he handles a lot of the mentorships with Vetsuko. Like when someone applies to be a mentor, I usually interview them first, and I send them off to Mark, and Mark gives them the okay, or basically the thumbs up or thumbs down. But we see in our students that the people who are talking to their mentors every week, that are pair programming with their mentors every week, they usually come out to be the strongest. Even in this past cohort, the two strongest developers, when I look at their metrics for how many times they met up with their mentor was incredibly busy. He was working with, they both had the same mentor. He was basically putting 4 to 6 hours a weekend of mentoring, and they came out really strong, so strong that people were retweeting their portfolios when they were done. So I think that's something that everybody should, especially if you're brand new, find somebody that's already made all the screw ups and all the mess ups that you haven't done yet. It's easy. I mean, that's the difference between wisdom and like intelligence. If you're smart, if you find somebody who has the experience of how to screw this up before you, and figure out like, all right, what not to do.
And it's important. It's really important because those kinds of relationships can last. They can last a lifetime. I mean, a mentor isn't just someone who tells you what to do and throws knowledge at you. They're a person that, as a result of them mentoring you, they're growing too. They're learning. They're looking at different ways to explain problems. Things that they just kind of remember or know how to do. Now they have to internalize it, and they have to break it down, and they have to think about it, and they have to make it clear. And sometimes, speaking from the standpoint of a mentor who does mentor people, there's been a lot of times when I've realized that what I thought was right is actually not an optimal approach, or the wrong approach, or just flat out dangerous, and it forces me to grow in a way. So, if you're out there looking and you're thinking, oh, that person is going to be too busy, or they won't want to mentor me, it doesn't really hurt to ask, because both of you get something out of that relationship.
Yeah.
Well, and the other piece I wanted to mention too is that it's not just the technical piece; it's the sort of professional career mentoring too, right? There's the technical piece of pair programming and coding and doing that, but especially with Vets Who Code, a lot of these folks are making a transition from a military background into the civilian world, and it's just a bit different. The networking piece is different. The people you meet, the interview prep, all those things are, can be very different than what the military is. So the mentoring piece is not just the technical part, but also the professional and the personal development part too.
Also, just to piggyback on what I believe Brian said it best, mentoring is a rewarding two-way street. So even if from your local user group or meetup group, whatever, if you're in a management role, please go out there and mentor someone that has no idea what they're doing. Because especially in the Ruby community, we're pretty much getting this slack in which people feel like it's matured and it's basically the good old boys club. And if you don't know how to use it now, then you're not going to be able to use it. It's going to be a steeper entry into being a Rails developer. You're even seeing that now with like some of the way the jobs are being written for Rails developers, where they're asking for, I saw like 5 come on my desk this week where they're looking for entry-level developers with a year's worth of production experience. I was like, that makes no sense. So if you haven't mentored, go out there, mentor, find somebody that wants to learn or is struggling to learn, or whoever at the local meetup has the biggest deer in the headlights look on them. That's the person you need to go and mentor, because that's the person that's, they want to learn, they're eager to learn, they're intimidated, they're probably going to become better developers than the people that you tend to gravitate towards, because they feel like they don't belong, and they're just so grateful for someone taking that opportunity and that chance with them, that you tell them to do something, they're going to do it, versus somebody who they've been they gravitate towards them early, and they're like, oh, they're the cool kid, or whatever. Then you're like, oh, well, we like this guy. So if he doesn't do what we tell him to do, or doesn't follow that direction, that's cool, because he's still a cool guy. Especially with the whole diversity and tech inclusion movement that we're trying to push as a community in regards to tech in the industry across the country. I mean, it's usually women, it's usually minorities who are going to these local meetups, and they're feeling out of place. And that's something that you guys can more better developers in the community can, alleviate that problem. So that's, I guess, that's your homework for the week if you're hearing this podcast. If you see someone at your local meetup that definitely looks lost, go out there and say, hey.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also just wanted to point out that if the qualifications for a mentor is having experience screwing stuff up, then I am overqualified.
Yeah.
Because I'm super good at screwing stuff up. We've been talking for close to an hour. I'm kind of curious if there are any other aspects of learning Rails or teaching Rails that we should dive into, just things that people don't think about when they're thinking, oh, I'm going to jump in and mentor somebody, or, ooh, I think I'm going to learn this new framework.
Learn JavaScript or CoffeeScript. I think that's one thing that, I think we have this running joke where, like I've said multiple times, many reasons people learn Ruby is because they hate JavaScript. But especially with what was said about Rails 5.1, that hate between JavaScript and Ruby is quickly eroding. They see that, the people who are creating the Rails framework are seeing the usefulness and a lot of the things that are coming up in the JavaScript framework and in JavaScript community in regards to Webpack and Node and React, Angular. So it's best to, go ahead and bite the bullet, learn JavaScript, learn CoffeeScript, learn these technologies so that way you can help make better Rails developers, because we're not seeing in the market, we're not seeing people that are just looking for pure Rubyists or pure Rails developers. They're looking for Rails developers that have experience with Electron, Rails developers have experience with Angular, Rails developers with React. That's all. That's what the market is moving towards. So you have to learn how to use these languages and these frameworks, and these libraries. So you might as well just go ahead and learn JavaScript as well.
Yeah, I've been focusing on React. That's been the latest thing I've been trying to spend more time with is React, and not just outside of this, just the general sort of making yourself more marketable. Back to the sort of teaching aspect, I think as teachers, we should be, if it's been 6 months or a year and you haven't been in an uncomfortable place with regard to learning goes, then I think as a, whether you're a teacher or a mentor, you're probably not doing your job. You should be in an uncomfortable place. So I've been in that for the last 6 weeks or so. I've been going through various React, specifically React and Rails tutorials. There's sort of a standard way, or there's one or two standard ways I've seen that folks are doing it. So I've been in that uncomfortable place. And okay, I want to put this thing here on the page, but like if it was purely Rails, I know how I would do it, but I don't really know how to do it inside React. So I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, I love that sentiment of making sure that you're uncomfortable every once in a while and pulling up a new technology. I've been feeling the same kind of things you're feeling, but not with React, but with Elm instead. And it's sort of the same thing, because it's making me do a lot of to make me rethink many years of experience with programming. It's making completely start over again, and it's nice because it's from a teaching standpoint and a mentoring standpoint, it puts you in the same mindset as your students, and this is one of the most difficult things that people who have good hearts and they really want to teach and they really want to give back and they really want to mentor. One of the biggest mistakes that they make is when they come into it is that they think that the way that you would write code at your day job is the way that everyone needs to learn how to do it.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is they'll say, "Oh yeah, you're new to Rails? Awesome. Here's all this cool stuff you should look at." And it just becomes incredibly overwhelming. And sometimes when you're teaching something, you're not going to start out with complex examples. You're going to start with very simple examples. And I can't count the number of times where, whether it's been in a book or in a presentation that I've given, somebody has to point out, well, why would you ever do it that way? That's a horrible way to do it. And it's not a horrible way to do it. It's not how I would do it if I was writing the code for real. But you're only seeing part of the process. You're not seeing the full process.
And
really, we got to get more complicated because they're simply not ready to do full-on test-first driven development with integration tests and functional tests. They're just not at that point yet.
So I think a lot of it, Yeah, I think a lot of it's just the way you approach it as a teacher from a standpoint of saying, listen, there are 1,000 ways to do this. I'm going to show you one, and it's the way that I do it. But just know that there are various, that there are, umpteen different ways to do it.
I also think that has to come into play of teaching from the position of a learner versus teaching from the position of a worker. One of the things, like for instance, going back to, I guess, because it's popular, going back to JavaScript, the book that gets recommended the most is Eloquent JavaScript. Well, if you're a person that has absolutely no experience in JavaScript, that book absolutely is, is terrifying. So the book I started recommending was JS for Kids, and people were like, "You're joking, right?" But I was like, the guy that wrote this book was a developer at Twitter for the front end. So I think, he knows what he's doing. The same thing with Ruby. Like a lot of people, the first book they recommend for Ruby is Programming Ruby, the Pickaxe. However, for me, I recommend Zed Shaw's Learn Ruby the Hard Way and Head First Ruby before we, and that's just the third book I recommend after people asking for resources. And it's because those books, like, a lot of people don't know Zed. Zed is an Army veteran. And so it's basically, as I like to say, is Army proof. And it's written really simple, almost like SOPs. And you can go through that book and, really get a really good understanding with Ruby from the core concepts of the language. So that's something that I would like to see more authors and more creators come from that perspective of, like, you're dealing with someone that has your experience and wants to learn versus trying to show, how smart they are when they're writing their books. Because that's what especially when I first started programming, that was one thing that kept me from liking certain authors or things of that nature. Just like, what? This book was more written, I felt like it was more written for this person's ego than to actually teach me something. Guy who do great jobs like that with authors are doing stuff. Brian Holt, Zed Shaw, Kyle Simpson, Sandy Metz, they all do really good jobs in being able to teach, write books and create material from the perspective of someone who has no clue what they're doing versus other authors who the book is more, just like I said, it feels more focused on letting me know that, you're really good at this. So I think that is one thing that as teachers, we all, and I catch myself in that trap all the time where I'm forgetting something that I've decided was common knowledge because I've used it so much. But then I have someone ask me, like, well, what does that do? So, oh yeah, you didn't know that? I'm like, oh, I shouldn't say that, because as a teacher, you have to assume that the learner doesn't know anything. You have to put, they are coming to you with that empty cup, and it's your job to fill it. And you have to make sure that you don't spill a drop and forget to fill it with something that's essential. So I think that's something that, as a community, when it comes to instruction, that's the hardest part of teaching and mentoring, is coming from the position of the learner. And what does the new learner not know?
When I first set foot in the classroom full time, I had to be observed by a faculty mentor and some other folks at the professional development. And the guy who ran professional development my first year of teaching used to have this saying that he would put on the note cards, and he would say it during the in-service and things that he would always point this out whenever we got off track. He would say, just a reminder, you are the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. You're not there to tell them everything, and you're not there to make everyone think that you're the coolest person up there. It's your job to guide someone to the solution. And that always stuck with me, and it always kind of was this way to keep me in check whenever I got off the path, whenever I thought, oh, this is going to be really cool, they're going to love this. And that's not really what they need. What they need is they need the pathway that's going to help them be successful.
Yeah, Boy Scouts calls this concept shadow leadership. And so essentially what it is that the boys run the program and the adult leaders are there basically to make sure that they don't hurt themselves and that they have transportation and things like that, and help manage the budget. But the boys run the program. And I think it's very similar here. If you're up there to try and, make it the program what you want it to be, that's different from if you're in there and actually helping these people chart their own course. So one more question that I want to ask, because this is Learning Rails 5. what if I'm a Rails 3 developer? How do I learn Rails 5? Is the approach the same, or are there just more things for me to learn?
Interesting. I would say, yeah, I think the approach is probably generally the same. If you're doing Rails 3 or Rails 4 now, you can look at it as you've got a great head start. I think that in my mind, the questions you would start asking yourself is, okay, what areas do I want to dig deeper in? Am I using Active Job or something like that where I can use the out of the box tools? What are my mailers looking like? Is there something that are there additions to the framework that have been added that I can start to use? Again, thinking about that convention over configuration mentality, are there conventions that have become more standardized moving from, again, something like version 3 to version 5 that I can begin to incorporate? I mean, I feel like one of the strengths of Rails, and this has been true for a decade or more now, is this convention over configuration mentality, and this idea that as a Rails developer, I can clone a repository, I can clone a Rails app, and within a relative short amount of time, I should be up and running and generally know that all the moving parts of this application. And the reason that's been true is because of the way things are built into the framework and the conventions that have been built in. So now, again, things like Action Mailer and Action Cable and those things are sort of beginning to standardize those things. So that would sort of be my advice for someone who is an existing Rails developer, but maybe on an older version of Rails.
And I would say to look at, maybe not read through and dig down on the change logs that much, but whenever Rails releases a new version, they post on their blog kind of like the highlights of what was introduced in this release. And if you're coming from Rails 3, go back and look at the Rails 4 and the Rails 5, the major releases to see what kind of new features were added in, and then just pinpoint on those features to, do a bit more independent research on them to see what those new features are about, kind of why they were added in, and how you could incorporate them into your application or use them as guiding tools to upgrade your older Rails application to a more current version.
All right. Anything else we should dig into before we go to picks?
I have one more, if we could. I'm curious if others have ideas about this. This idea of writing, I've got, and Chuck, if you can include this, I've got a Medium article that I wrote, and it's entitled 2 Writing Assignments for New Programmers. One of the things I do in my class is I have 2 writing assignments that they do. One is on diversity and technology, and I have them read an article related to just diversity in technology and some of the challenges there. And then we use Moodle as the learning management system, so it's a forum assignment. I have them post to a forum, their thoughts. I pose some questions to them and have them post there. And then I also have another writing assignment that they do. But I'm curious about and part of that, a lot of the pushback, I've gotten some pushback from students that said, hey, I'm here to learn coding and programming. I'm not here to learn writing. So why am I having to do this assignment? And my explanation is always that, again, part of being a developer is to be an effective communicator, not just in person, but also, listen, there are more and more virtual and remote jobs. And even if you're in a physical location with other developers, you're going to be using lots of email. So that's my argument, is that you need to be an effective communicator and an effective writer. I folks' thoughts.
I agree wholeheartedly. People who were in my classes did a lot of writing, a lot of communicating, and I got a lot of the same pushback that you got. And my response was plainly that your job as a software developer is 20% code and 80% dealing with people and their problems and their issues and their requests and their desires. Yep. You have political things to deal with. You have emails to read and emails to write. You will make a mistake and have to write a post-mortem at some point. It's a guarantee that there'll be some situation where you'll have to advocate for a belief or an idea that you have. Maybe that's in written form, or maybe that's from a public speaking during a meeting. You have to be prepared for those. And I always put it on me as it is my responsibility as your instructor to prepare you for all of those scenarios, not just the ones where you're given a specification and need to turn it into code. So that's how I always handle it. And I still firmly believe that the best software developers that I know, the most successful software developers that I know, are people who are great software developers who also are great with the written word.
I think DHH has a great post on signal and noise. Chuck, I may dig that up. You can include that in the show notes too, on writing and why it's important and why they only hire. I think DHH is sort of posing it from a standpoint of hiring new developers, but why writing is important and communicating is important for the software developers that 37 Signals hires.
I'm assuming that your school had a committee or so of people in the industry, right, that advises your program on what to include. Right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, and most of the schools have that. We always ask, what are the most important skills you want our students to have? And the top three were all what some people call soft skills. I just think of them as skills because they're important. It was always communication, work ethic, and things like that. Of course, being able to solve problems and show up was important, but learning, knowing specific programming language X was much, much farther down the list than be a good communicator.
And I don't want to, it's interesting. I was going to say, if you can't if you can't show up to work on time and communicate with your colleagues, then none of the other technical skills matter. However, that being said, and I'm sure Jerome can speak to this, hiring, when you still look at requirements for job requirements, it's all technical. And if you can't sort of pass that technical hurdle, then you never get a chance to, talk about more soft skills. So that's the reality of work.
I do want to push back on that just a tiny bit because the test there.
That's a negative for me. Communication is like the number one thing that employers are looking for. DHH actually came into our Slack channel and he did an AMA with our veterans, and he told them that writing trumps your ability to communicate trumps language you're learning 10 to 1. He'll hire a mediocre programmer with better communicating skills than a rock star programmer who has the communication skills of a rock 10 times to 1. So I am very much against the idea of that's usually like how when people ask, they want great communicators before the programmers. They'll take a chance on a guy or a girl or on a troop that can communicate well. That's why we make our troops write so much.
Okay. No, that's encouraging to hear. And I like, so the reason I mentioned that is I see a lot, especially for remote jobs, is they have these blind committees, and you've got this, crazy. I had one student I was mentoring, and he was sort of lamenting to me that the technical challenges, the work sample that they had to do up front before he even got an interview and had to do anything, was so focused on those technical challenges that was sort of one of the frustrations he had.
Well, we give those. I mean, where I currently work now, we give those kinds of things out. But the job description might not say anything about those kinds of communication skills and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I guarantee you, we're testing for them from the second you hit that application button.
Sure.
We're looking at your cover letter. We're looking at how you communicate with how you communicate with your skills on your resume and your cover letter, and in your conversations, your email conversation with the hiring manager or the recruiting manager or whoever, your communication skills are being assessed continuously through the interview process. You're going to write some code and it's going to feel like you're focusing on the technical stuff when you're doing the homework assignment. But I'll tell you right now, if you turn the homework assignment back in and you say, "Here it is,"
yeah.
We're going to evaluate you on your, every company will evaluate you on your communication skills at that point. Like, why not take a few moments to summarize your experience with it and talk about, what you encountered. That's the kind of stuff that it's done as a filter, because a lot of these positions have, hundreds upon hundreds of applicants just for one or two open positions. There's got to be a way to filter people out quickly. And that tends to be the easiest way.
Well, that's encouraging to hear, because just for every person like my student who was complaining about that, there's probably people who they may not be voicing it, but they're great technically and they had a great work sample, but they didn't get a call back for a second or third interview because of poor communication skills.
Yep. Well, this is a whole episode or 3 that we could do on just this topic. And I tell people this too. It's yeah, they're evaluating as much for fit as they are for, technical skill.
It's
once they know you can solve the problem, then they want to know that you can work well with their team.
Yeah, that's what we tell our students. They're looking for the person who can do the job, the first person who can do the job they like the most. You got to understand, people they're going to be spending more time with you than their families, so they don't want a person they're going to want to push out of a window. So, keep that in mind and show your personality. Let them know that don't go full as we like to say, but show people that they're going to enjoy working with you. Try to put yourself in the role of their coworker. Try to put that in their mind early on. See how your process of how to solve problems and how it will benefit them and alleviate some of the problems that they're having. That's what you're there for. So that's something
the last thing I want to say is, with being in the professional world, as a developer, I talk to non-developers more often than not. Rather than the team that I work with on a day-to-day basis, I have to talk with QA people, with project managers, scrum masters, and support people, implementation people. So it's very important to have that communication skill. If I cannot convey an issue or convey a proposed solution to a problem that they can understand, then we will implement and develop the wrong thing. If I can't get out of these people what they're envisioning, then we're going to develop the wrong thing. So communication, is extremely important to have that good skill set. And a lot of times I'll speak to my wife and try to convey a programming idea to someone who is completely not tech savvy. She has trouble turning on the Apple TV sometimes. So I will try to communicate a programming concept to her with analogies or something that she can understand. And that helps me on a daily basis to practice my communication skills to someone who is not tech savvy, to communicate an idea to where they can understand and then have a conversation on.
We call that Folly Fridays at my house. I pick a subject and I try to explain it to my 13-year-old in a way that he can understand. And mind you, he's a 13-year-old, so he doesn't care anything that I say. So it's a very fun experiment for me.
But yeah, let's go ahead and do some picks. I think there's some great information in here for people who want to learn or level up on Rails. This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Are you searching for a new job? That can be stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through the interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary, offer, or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you, and on Hired you receive personal interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about what opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Hired offers access to more than 4,000 innovative employers, including big brand names like Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. And we help you find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let them know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance. And if you sign up today using the show's link, that's hired.com/rubyrogues, you can get double the normal hiring bonus. That's $600 instead of $300. So go check them out at hired.com/rubyrogues. Dave, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, sure. I just have one. It's called Groovebox. It's a theme for your editor or your IDE, and it's very easy on the eyes. I have bad eyesight, so when I'm staring at the dark glow of my computers at night, having a gentle on the eyes theme is very nice. And it's GRUVBOX.
Nice. Brian, what are your picks?
I have two picks this week. The first one is, since we've been talking about writing, one of the things we never really get to cover is, well, how do you, maybe you don't have those kinds of skills, how do you get those kinds of skills? And just like with software development, you can develop those skills through practicing. But there is a good guide out that you can get called Keys to Great Writing. It's a book by Stephen Wilbers. I highly recommend it because it talks about grammar rules, revision strategies, and really walks you through how to find your voice. I've gotten copies of this book for lots of different people, and I strongly recommend it. So if you're looking for ways to help level up those skills, that'd be a good place to look. And the other pick I have is Rails, and not the Rails that includes every gem under the sun, but Rails. The last two projects I've worked on with Rails, I decided to just constrain myself to using whatever comes stock with Rails. So what that means is I've sort of thrown out RSpec and Cucumber, and I decided just what's the stock testing, mini test. I started just using that because I encountered several situations in the past where I kind of gone where the crowd had gone, and then got stuck doing Rails upgrades, and I spent a lot of time with the test. So a year ago, I sort of resolved on these new projects to do this, to stay with just what's in the tin. And I've got to say, here a year later, I'm upgrading these applications to Rails 5.1, and the process has just been so smooth. And I'm not saying I'm not using any gems. Like, I'm using Devise because who wants to write their authentication stuff from scratch? But the rest of it has been incredibly nice. It's been simpler to reason about. And so that's why I'm sort of having just use the default Rails stack renaissance over here. So that's my other pick.
Awesome. Jerome, what are your picks?
Roger that. I only have 2 picks today. My first pick is going to be a Medium article that I'm sharing about Rails 5.1 loves JavaScript, piggybacking on what I said earlier in the cohort about being able to use more JavaScript with Rails. So that is my first pick. Second pick is HackerRank. They have a really good Ruby track that I think those who are more concerned with the idea of getting more into Ruby and getting a deeper dive into Ruby to become better Rails developers, I highly recommend. It's free, something that you should definitely do if you haven't done a deep dive into Ruby in quite a bit.
All right, I'm going to jump in here with a couple of picks myself. The first one is I was kind of laid up for a couple days last week, and so I wound up basically watching some shows and playing some games, and I picked up a couple of games that I'm kind of enjoying. One of them is called Clash Castle, I think, or Castle Clash. Anyway, it's kind of like Clash of Clans if you played that. A little bit different gameplay mechanisms and stuff, but I'm enjoying that. And then another one is Mobile Strike, which is, if you played Game of War, it's like that, except it's a lot simpler in a lot of ways, and so I'm enjoying that as well. I also really wanted to shout out about and pick something that Brian has worked on for years. I found out when I interviewed him for my Ruby story, and that is railsmentors.org. So if you're out there looking for a mentor, you want to mentor people, that is a terrific resource, and I'm going to recommend that as well. And then finally, just a quick reminder to go check out rubydevsummit.com. It's free. It's online. So, as long as you can get on the internet when the talks are going, you can watch them. If you want the recordings, you want to be in the Slack channel and stuff, you have to pay for that. But if you want to just participate and watch and, have kind of the in-webinar Slack or chat, not the Slack, but just chat, then you can get in for free. You just go in and you enter your email address, and it gets you access to all that stuff. Mark, what are your picks? So
my picks are, I've got a few picks. So real quick, my technical pick is Grammarly, I think is what it is for. It's a Chrome plugin. It's great for us people who are challenged by spelling, and we were discussing writing. So it's a great tool for that. I've been using the free version for a few months now, and it's great. It's improved my emails by orders of magnitude. So that's one pick. My book pick is The History of Pi, and it's Beckman, I guess is the guy's last name, Peter Beckman. Sort of old school book. I think it's first published in 1971. It's just a fun little book. If your local library probably has a copy of it, stop by and you can probably read it in a couple of sittings. But I still come back to it from time to time and read various chapters from it. And then I think Avdi used to do beer picks, so I think I'll do a beer pick, and that'll be Sierra Nevada's West Coast Stout. If you like a dark beer, that's my recommendation.
Awesome. And if people want to follow up on this episode with you, or just follow you on Twitter, see what you're doing on GitHub, where do they go?
At Mark Locklear. That's sort of the home of everything Mark Locklear. I've got a link to my website there, locklear.me. But yeah, please follow me and just say hi if you like on Twitter.
Is that the first pick we've ever had that was a beer? Like
Avdi used to do. No, I'm pretty sure Avdi used to do beer picks all the time, right?
Okay. I was like, is that an achievement unlocked?
Yeah, yeah. He picked quite a few of them.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna start like picking random food.
Yeah, David Brady was trying to do hot sauces too for a while there. So
that's a good one. Hot sauce is a great one.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this one up. Thanks for coming, Mark. We'll go ahead.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here. I've been a long time listener, so it's sort of a kick for me to be able to actually be on as a guest.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap this one up, and we'll catch everyone next week.
Talk to y'all later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.